Thank you all for braving the weather. Welcome to the Azure West Michigan Azure User Group Meetup. First one of 2024. So, a good holiday break. Fantastic speaker for us today, and one of the organizers of the Azure User Group. So, I'll be honest, my brain's fried. I've been in a meeting for 2 days straight in a hotel conference room. I didn't have any windows, and I barely hear. So, in case you don't know me, I'm Brian McHugh, one of the organizers of KIN. This is our first session here at the new Vervins location. So, round of applause from Vervins and Cam. Thank you. We'll probably be here multiple times, but we may rotate as the year goes on. I'll talk about that at the end. And a couple other house cleaning things at the end as well. But if you do need anything, I believe if I have this right, restrooms are the door to your left,
Yep.
Right around that.
Yep. There's a black wall right there, and it's kind of a horseshoe shape, and there's all individual stalls right around that whole area.
Thank you. So if you need that, please feel free. And I'll say that's probably it. I don't think there's any other details. We'll just kick it off. Let Matt talk about .NET 8 and Azure Functions, and then we'll have some discussion at the end. So thank you very much for coming.
Awesome. Thank you. So yeah, we're going to talk about some .NET 8 and Azure Functions. .NET 8 came out in November, and we wanted to kind of tie it together with the Azure User Group. And we thought, hey, people are going to be upgrading their .NET applications. A lot of people probably have a lot of functions, so this could be a good tie-in to the Azure User Group and the new year. So real quick, my name is Matt Shanahan. I'm a principal software engineer at Meijer on the digital services team. So I see a lot of Meijer folks here. Glad you all can make it out. I work very closely with many of you. I work on the platform that handles a lot of our e-commerce stuff. So our shopping experience, our mobile app, our website, all that kind of stuff. So I'm really excited to be here talking about this. I've done very similar presentations to many people at Meijer. So we're well underway getting our functions and getting our environment all upgraded to .NET 8. So we're going to talk about a couple different things. .NET 8, what's new? There are a few things in both the framework. It's weird referring to .NET as a framework since .NET Framework was a framework, but now got just .NET, .NET Core. And then also tying it into Azure Functions, how it relates to .NET 8, and potentially choosing the right path forward. So there are a few different paths that you can take when you're deciding to upgrade, if you want to upgrade. Maybe you don't. So we'll talk about that a little bit here too. So why do we need to upgrade our .NET framework? So as you can see here, we've got .NET 6, which came out in November of 2021. And we've got this nice big purple transitioning blue line, which ends here in November 2024. .NET 6 was the last LTS release that came out before .NET 8. So .NET 7, if you're doing your math correctly, came out in November 2022. That goes on to support in May 2024. So about 4 months away, and .NET 7 will be out of support. So that is a standard term support release, which is only patched for 18 months, which is why most organizations don't upgrade to .NET 7. .NET 8 came about in November, and now we have that, which is good, until November of 2026. If I'm doing my math, 2025, I believe. So yes, 36 months. So no, that is 2026, sorry. Yeah, so good for 3 years. So in November 2025, we will have .NET 10, which will then overlap with our long-term support release of .NET 8, which we are now on. So we want to maintain a current LTS version so that we've got a long-lived, well-supported .NET 8 .NET platform that we're using that Microsoft can help support in the cloud and with application development. You're also going to get just a lot more security updates, patches, performance improvements over time. All that stuff is going to come into play as you're using these LTS versions. They tend to be a lot more stable, whereas the STS, you're going to be getting introduced some more features, functionality, and get that time, that year to bake before the LTS version comes out. So in .NET 8, we've got a few new things that were pretty big and worth highlighting. Microsoft since 2024 is the year of AI. I kind of think 2023 was. We had a huge influx of AI, ChatGPT, a lot of different things came out. Microsoft since 2024, so maybe we should kind of lean into that a little bit. And we have large language model support built into the .NET framework in .NET 8. So some really cool stuff that you can play around with there. How many of you have played around with AI, especially after like Joel's presentation and stuff? All right. Yeah, so we got a few people. I think Joel is using, is it Python maybe? Is that what he's using? But yeah, so Joel demoed last time some Python stuff, but we got some large language model support built into .NET 8 now that we can leverage. We've also got Blazor Web UI. So if anyone's played around with Blazor or MVC, this is kind of the next evolution of that. It's tying together both the server side and the client side frameworks into what was formerly called Blazor United. And so now they have Blazor Web UI, which went GA in November for .NET 8. That is their full stack web dev framework that you can use to start rolling out web applications, kind of tie in. So if you're a C# developer, backend developer, you might be a lot more comfortable with this than you would be trying to do separate like web API, Angular, React apps, stuff like that. C# 12, of course, we've got a lot of nice new language features there. I'm not going to cover every one of them in detail. If you really want to, we've got some links at the end that we'll post along with YouTube video, different resources. Primary constructors, collection expressions, inline arrays, optional lambda parameters, ref read-only parameters. We've got the ability to alias any type. We have a new experimental attribute, which lets us, very similar to the way that we mark classes, methods as obsolete, we can mark things as experimental. And then we also have an experimental feature, not to be confused with that attribute, called interceptors. So this one I'm really looking forward to seeing how it evolves. But basically, if anyone's looked at this, you know then you can kind of substitute things at runtime using like your CS proj file, so build in like different things that might place other pieces of functionality. It's a really interesting feature. I'm really looking forward to kind of seeing how that plays out. Has anyone played around with that yet or looked into it? Okay. Yeah, so it is an experimental feature in C# 12. Microsoft says you have to enable it first, and then you can start kind of playing around with it. I did want to highlight the primary constructor here. I know a couple of you have probably used primary constructors already, Joe. You and your team have probably used some of these primary constructors. How do you like that syntax? Yeah, that's kind of my feeling too. So instead of like, if you would typically declare your class and you would have a constructor and you would inject your iService in there, you would typically have a read-only reference to the iService and then reference that as _service.getDistance. The reason I don't necessarily love this syntax is because it looks, the way that we're declaring service here, it looks the same as a variable would, it looks the same as a parameter would. I think it was a lot more clean to have the underscore syntax there. But I don't know, who likes this format?
I like it.
Because I don't.
Not the others.
If you like it.
No, I was wondering, can you declare it as like private and then an underscore?
By default, it's already private, so it's scoped just to that whole class. If you really wanted to, yeah, absolutely. You could just put an underscore there and define your naming convention. But I believe the way that Microsoft has defined it, and like if I try putting an underscore there, Visual Studio wants to fix it and put that.
Can you
But
change that in your editor?
you probably could. Yeah, I've not played around with it. This is just kind of the default and what I've seen implemented in several of our projects that we've upgraded to .NET 8. This is one that I think is really interesting that came out with .NET 8. So there are a couple things that were pretty big in .NET 8 that I called out on their own slides. This is one of them. .NET Aspire. Has anyone played around with this yet? Brian has. Okay. So .NET Aspire is a way that you can kind of tie together, bring together multiple applications when you're doing microservice development, be able to plug in like different components. So you have like a Redis database, a Cosmos database, storage account, be able to plug in different containers, different applications, spin them all up, see a unified dashboard of how these applications are running, be able to collect all their telemetry together. Basically, you have your own like farm that you are running this application in locally. Brian, what's been your experience so far?
So this is not my specialty by any means. So it's been a slightly difficult learning curve. because it is a different way to approach some of these things, but it feels almost like you have like a recipe more, you're like using that recipe versus before you might try to do a microservice and spin up like one component part of it and go, wait, I don't know what next thing is I need to do. So that's some kind of like finding your own way. This is more, here's the way you should do it, these sets of things. That's, I guess, what I've gotten out of it so far.
Yeah, so I think the way that I understand it, I've read through, I've not played around with this yet. But my understanding is that when you add Aspire, you add it to your projects, your solutions, and then you can run these Aspire projects. It spins up a dashboard and you can use that dashboard then to monitor everything. It's going to create all of the different containers that you need, spin up the other projects, applications that it needs, and get everything running kind of as a cohesive microservice environment that you can then use. So all of that stuff that is baked into the recipe, as Brian referred to it, that is that other Aspire project that got added into there.
I mean, you watch them and their people at Microsoft talk about this is like the new best thing. They're really pushing it, really, really.
So do you know if this is meant to like replace like Azure Monitor and other like related services, or is it work alongside with those services?
So I would say this is more for local development and
Okay.
debugging
Got it.
versus Azure Monitor, where it's going to be
I see.
in your deployed environment.
Okay, thank you.
So it's just a couple screen grabs that Microsoft posted. I did not do these, but just showing the dashboard here. It's a little small to see, but you've got a various number of metrics there that are being created. Here they've got like projects, containers. I can't see that one. Logs, traces, metrics. So all of these things. This is your Aspire dashboard here that you can then drill into. And here you can see if anyone's familiar with App Insights and how the calls may be made across multiple services here, you can see that same type of thing there within the Aspire dashboard. So really, really cool environment. I would love to see us use that a little bit more, be able to pull down projects and spin them up together, run them as microservices. We've been talking about doing that quite a bit lately in our area. So really excited to kind of see how this evolves and how people use it.
Different pieces for this one has to be the same project for Aspire to work. Like,
That's my understanding right now, but perhaps within the recipe, I don't know, Brian, if you got this far or not, you can, maybe you could specify like another container and configuration to provide that container. So I could say like, you know, here's our container registry, pull this project, this tag, and be able to run that as part of my project.
Yeah, I would agree. That's everything's been in one project that I've seen. But I guess they could something bring nothing.
Sorry to put you on.
It's all right.
So speaking of containers, you know, really nice segue to the way that .NET is approaching containers in .NET 8. So they've created some more hardened containers, being able to run the containers as a less privileged user. So if anyone has ever tried creating a Docker file and putting it through like a security scanner, you may get some complaints that, hey, this is running as root and you shouldn't do that. Well, they're right. And now Microsoft is not running as root. They've got a separate app user that they're able to run their containers as and be able to run that as a less privileged user, make sure that things are a little bit more safe, keep the security scanners and the security people happy. They've also got smaller base images, as well as some different like composite base images. They did a lot of stuff with their base images. You see that here on the screen, you know, multiple times. A distro list, very chiseled based image. And then a couple different things regarding productivity. So non-root user, supporting all of the different Azure authentication, authorization methods. And you can also publish it with the .NET SDK. That's not new to .NET 8. That came out maybe with .NET 7, but there's some .NET Docker commands that you can run in the CLI to be able to kick that off and then specify your Docker build parameters within the CS proj versus having a Docker file within your application. So they just did some additional work around that, kind of solidified it. Again, the LTS release versus the STS release. So they had that year to kind of bake it in, get things a little bit more hardened, solidify it in .NET 8. And now it's available to everyone. So if you want to upgrade to .NET 8, the most common scenarios that I've seen So you got your web apps and your function apps. Web apps are super easy to upgrade. As long as you're upgrading from a .NET Core or above application, so like .NET Core 3.1 and up, it is really a very simple upgrade. Microsoft has upgrade tools that you can download. It's an extension for Visual Studio. They also have a CLI extension that you can install and pretty much just run a simple command, right click on the project file, upgrade, and it'll do most of the work for you there. Every time that I've done that, it's worked. I have not encountered any issues with web apps. They have all worked. The only issues that I've encountered have been with other dependencies. Like if we have a dependency that introduces a breaking change, maybe that's going to be a problem. Maybe there's another dependency. I try to recommend that we upgrade all of our dependencies at the time when we do our .NET 8 upgrade, just to make sure that we're using the latest, the greatest, most secure. And so that's where I've encountered the difficulties. But doing the actual .NET 8 upgrade has been super easy, super smooth with web apps. Mostly automatic, and yeah, very few breaking changes. So going through the Microsoft Docs, I mean, you can confirm the same thing. There are very few breaking changes between .NET 6, .NET 8 there. Enter functions. This is where it gets a little bit more fun, more tricky. So right now, the automatic upgrade process from an Azure function that is running in .NET 6 using the in-process runtime, and we'll get into that more in a minute. It wants to update it to the isolated runtime by default. And that's because right now in .NET 8, there is no in-process runtime. It's coming. Microsoft has said it's coming. But Microsoft has also said that .NET 8 is going to be the last version that supports the in-process runtime. So that's why they went out with the isolated runtime first. And that's why by default, it's trying to upgrade function apps from an in-process to an isolated. So that's where it gets really challenging. And I have never been able to just upgrade a function app and have it work right out of the box the same way that the web apps do. That's where it gets really tricky, especially if you have a lot of function endpoints, because it's that surface level. All of your functions, your triggers, your bindings, everything in there is where things get really tricky and really sticky trying to upgrade from the isolated or from the in-process to the isolated. Total API differences there. It also creates a new program CS file. So function apps by default do not have a program CS file. There are different SDK APIs that you use. There are multiple HTTP APIs that you can use for your functions. So we'll kind of talk about that a little bit. And then if anyone is familiar with the differences in serialization, so several years ago, Microsoft introduced their system text JSON serializer. If you move from an in-process function to an isolated, it changes the way that serialization works out of the box. It does use system text JSON by default now. So if you try to serialize a J object, a J token object from the Newtonsoft library, it's not going to work out of the box if you're just upgrading and throwing it into a .NET 8 isolated function, or any isolated function for that matter. If you already have isolated functions, great, your update process is probably going to be pretty easy. But at Meijer, we do not have a lot of isolated functions at this point. We have hundreds and hundreds of functions, and I would say 99% of them are in process at this point. So we are in the process, no pun intended, of upgrading to isolated functions there. Yeah.
Do you know if there's a way to change the default serializer pretty easily, or is it kind of?
Yes. Yes, there is a way to change the default serializer. I'll cover that a little bit later, but because of the way that .NET is so compostable, you can plug in different middleware to the isolated model, and that includes a Newtonsoft JSON middleware that you can easily plug in and apply your default serialization settings.
Thank you.
Yeah. I know this is hard to see, but I'm not going to cover all the differences here. What I will say though, so here is the isolated worker model versus the in-process worker model. And what's important is that most of these say that they're supported. The big thing that I found that's not supported, but also not very heavily used, is the not supported. Okay, so middleware is not supported in the in-process model, but there is a way around that. And I know several of you that I've worked with you're very familiar with that, the way that we do middleware, dependency injection. So there is a way that you can do that with in-process functions and use some additional extensions that you plug in via NuGet packages. The other one that I found here that I was looking for earlier, where was it? There we go. Imperative bindings. So in-process was early on, isolated is now the newer modern one to go with. Imperative bindings is not supported with the isolated worker model. I've only seen that used, like I mentioned, in like 1 or 2 function apps. It is not very heavily used. I have seen it used to connect to the storage account that is being used to actually run the function, which is not a good practice. And so that's why you probably don't see it used a whole lot. But instead of like connecting via a connection string or a secret, it's going to wire that up via dependency injection, be able to connect that right into the caller method and be able to instantiate that at runtime. So same as you would do like any other dependency injection. You can do that there, but here it's recommending that it works with SDK types directly. So storage accounts, Cosmos DB, service bus. So if you need to use that stuff, get rid of the imperative bindings and go directly with those SDKs instead. All right, so here's where things do get a little bit tricky. I mentioned serialization. So watch out for that for sure. In some of my first functions that I was upgrading, that I was testing out, I did not necessarily realize the differences in serialization until I started outputting and comparing the differences. And I noticed the one from the .NET 6 in-process function compared to the .NET 8 isolated function. So the .NET 6, it was serializing all of my properties as camel case. In .NET 8, it was serializing everything as Pascal case. And if anybody is familiar with mobile app development, iOS does not like that at all. And that's going to break a lot of clients. So you need to be very careful, make sure that serialization matches exactly. So that's one of the things that I ran into. And there are a few ways that you can solve this. So I put together a demo app that I'll talk about a little bit later. But right here, one of the ways, so Matt asked about changing the default serializer. You can do that very easily within the program CS file. You can use Newtonsoft JSON and you can set the default serialization settings very similar to how you would do like a web app. So most web apps that I've worked with, I see people using Newtonsoft on. It just seems to be a lot more prevalent. People feel more comfortable with it. It's also the default serializer that's used by like the Cosmos DB SDK. And so when you start querying Cosmos, you're going to get back objects in the Newtonsoft format. So that is a dependency of the Cosmos DB SDK right now. The other way that I've seen, so when I played around with this a little bit, and I was querying a Cosmos database in my demo here, and I got back a JSON object that was serialized using Newtonsoft, and I tried outputting that. It was returning a bunch of blank properties. And what I had to do is basically deserialize it as a string from the Newtonsoft and then reserialize it as an object into the system text JSON, which just seems like a really hacky workaround. So that was how I kind of got around that. What we've also done in other applications is wrap some of that serialization stuff into like helper methods. Maybe your function has like different helper methods that you're using to create your HTTP responses, stuff like that. And maybe that can make your upgrade process a little bit easier, as it has for us in many cases, where we can just wrap some of that and then swap out the helper method that it's using, handle everything under the hood. The other thing that I've noticed is HTTP. So there are several different ways here that you can return your HTTP responses and get back and accept your HTTP requests. So, for example, in the in-process functions, the HTTP request is going to be HTTP request data, I believe. Whereas in isolated, it's going to be just HTTP request. There are some differences there in the way that those objects are. the way that their properties are, that they expose their request and response streams. One way that you can handle that is there is an ASP.NET Core integration that you can very easily add into your function. So by default, when you upgrade your function app into an isolated function, there is a line in the program CS that says like add function worker default. And you can replace that with add web application default or something like that. Don't take that verbatim. But that's going to allow you to use the same type of HTTP request model that you see within ASP.NET Core applications. So that kind of streamlines a little bit some of that code that you have between like a web app and a function app. So if you have a lot of function apps and you have a few web apps, maybe you want to consider this, especially if you have middleware. So if you have middleware that you're going to be using to do things like authentication, if you're going to be connecting to other services, you've got special things that you need to wire up or connect to for logging, and you have middleware that's in your application, if you were to use this ASP.NET Core integration, it's going to simplify the way that your code is shared across those different applications, because now the request pipeline for function apps becomes nearly identical to that of your ASP.NET Core applications. I will say though, it does not work for all cases. So if you have a durable function, for example, and you are trying to output the HTTP response for an asynchronous HTTP call. So if anyone's familiar with that, you would call into a request and say, hey, Jake, generate me this report. Jake will give me back an ID and he'll say, all right, check back later. Well, you can do that with a durable function, and the function's going to run in the background. And then later on, I'll take that ID and I'll say, hey, Jake, is this report ready? And he's going to say yes or no. If it's ready, I'll get back the report. No, he says it's not ready. So I don't get back the report yet. I got to check again. And so that durable function is going to continue doing its thing in the background. But it needs to output an ID so that I can go and check back later. And if you use that ASP.NET Core integration, that output does not work correctly because it's bound to the function worker runtime versus the web application runtime. So that's one of the issues that I found with that. Another common thing that I've been asked, and I've done a lot of digging into this, is performance. Many people have done different analysis on this performance between in-process and isolated functions. I wanted to do some of my own analysis because I've been asked that several times. And I've come up with some pretty interesting numbers. Most of them don't concern me, but a couple do. So for my test here, I set up a K6 load test. I did 3 iterations. So I ran this test 3 times each. In that test, there were 3 stages. And this was honestly just something I kind of copied and pasted off of the K6 example site, and it worked really well. So I had 10 VUs, virtual users, 20 VUs, and 0 VUs respectively in each of the stages that it ran through. I used Windows hosted Y1 consumption plan function apps. I also had a Cosmos database with 1,000 RUs allocated. I had a single get endpoint in my function, and within there, I would retrieve a document from Cosmos and return that to the user. So that's what the setup looked like for that test. So I first started with the .NET 6 in-process application. In those 3 minutes, it completed 8,479 requests at an average request time of 102.63 milliseconds. Taking that application, upgrading it to a .NET 6 isolated app, running it in a similar function. So all of these had very similar plan setup, similar function apps. The only difference was if it was an in-process or an out-of-process, and had the configuration set for .NET 8 versus .NET 6. .NET 6 isolated. Within those 3 iterations, it averaged only 6,878 requests at an average time of 122.54 milliseconds. So pretty significant drop in performance there between those 2 in .NET 6. .NET 8 gets a little better though. And so I feel better about the .NET 8 direction, and I feel better about directing people to go ahead and do that upgrade to .NET 8. .NET 8 completed 7,509 requests in those same 3 minutes at an average response time of 111.84 milliseconds. So overall, not bad. I was very happy with the .NET 8 numbers, but here's where I get a little bit concerned. I know several of us have dealt with connection issues before on function apps. Yeah. All right, so here's our function app that is running in the in-process .NET 6 application. So our functions here tops off at about 19. Over here, our functions top off at 57 in the .NET 8 isolated realm. I know we've seen differences in different environments. So some of that stuff I think still needs to be kind of put to the test and really see what happens. Even doing extensive load testing in our environments between a production environment and a lower environment, we've seen differences there too that we have not been able to really identify. So those numbers do concern me a little bit, but we'll have to see. I can only imagine though, given the direction that Microsoft is going, putting more time and resources and getting rid of the in-process worker runtime after .NET 8, the isolated is only going to get better. I have to mention that. The other thing worth noting here, and again, these numbers are kind of small, but the memory utilization here. So the memory utilization of the in-process function tops off at just over 300, whereas the isolated gets up to about 650. So the isolated uses significantly more memory. I did a little bit of research on that, and the consensus seems to be, yes, that's accurate. Because when you run the isolated function, you're running the entire runtime in memory within this compiled application, versus the runtime in process function is being run outside of that process as part of the function app itself. So that's why you see these differences here. And that's been my experience across every application that I've run so far. I can tell you, as soon as I deployed a .NET 8 application, shot the memory up immediately. And I'm like, well, you can see where I deployed it. But yeah, so that was a little bit concerning. I'm definitely going to keep an eye on the connections issue though, because that's one that we've definitely struggled with in the past. All right, so you've got a few options here. So .NET 8 is the last version for in-process worker runtimes. So if you want, you can upgrade your in-process function to .NET 8. That's probably where it's going to be until you either get forced to upgrade or just live with an outdated runtime, or you just end up killing off the app at some point. The in-process runtime is very tightly coupled to the actual function runtime that is executing your application. And what I mean by that, so many of you have probably used .NET Framework. Who's familiar with the GAC, the Global Assembly Cache? Yeah. Okay, so the Global Assembly Cache in the .NET Framework was a set of assemblies that was installed by the framework or by somebody else that were accessible to any application running on that server. And if anyone has ever used or fought with Log4Net, you're probably familiar, although you may not know it, with the Global Assembly Cache. So this is what happens when you have a tightly coupled runtime in your functions and you try to upgrade one of your assemblies that function is also being responsible for. You run into compatibility issues. Your function doesn't start because even though you have an explicit reference in your project file, it says, I can't find this assembly version. And that's because it is binding to the assembly version that exists in that function runtime, regardless of what you specify in that CS proj. There's a workaround. It's kind of hacky in my opinion. You basically tell it, I want to use this one versus the other. But you have to specify that for each of the assemblies that you find. Some of the ones that I've found issues with are the JWT system.identity libraries, as well as Dynatrace. If anybody has ever used that before and tried plugging that into their functions, there are some compatibility issues there with the native in-process functions that you might try applying that to. So if you have an existing application and over the next couple of years, remember, .NET 8 is going to be around until November 2026. If you imagine that your application is going to be deprecated before that, out of service before that, then maybe you just want to go ahead and update to the in-process model and not even worry about the isolated one. As we've also seen though, the in-process is faster. So if you have performance that is absolutely critical, and again, like 10 milliseconds, okay? Is your application really that critical? I don't know. You can make that determination, but if performance is that critical, then maybe you want to do an in-process upgrade instead. And you have minimal external dependencies. So you've got a lot of different NuGet packages that you might be plugging in, upgrading, adding new functionality to, adding different logging mechanisms. If your function is not going to be doing a lot of that, then maybe an in-process function is fine for you as well. With an isolated function, it's running more as a console app. It's running as an executable. One of the things that you notice if you do a diff after the upgrade to .NET 8 is there's actually a line in there that says exe within the CS prod file. So this gets run as a console app, and it is not bound to any of the runtime DLLs. So all of those get packaged up and run with the application, regardless of what is in the function runtime. So it runs completely outside of that process in its own isolated, protected process. So things tend to be a little bit more stable than if you're doing an isolated function app. This is also really good if you have a long-lived application. So if you're going to keep this around for many years to come, you're going to keep maintaining it, building upon it, or maybe it's just something that needs to be out there. Maybe you're not really maintaining it, building upon it, but you need to keep it updated so that it's secure. You've got the latest and greatest like DLLs and libraries and security patches. Maybe it's a good idea to update that. New applications. I can't imagine that you would be building an application now and thinking, yeah, this is going to be dead by 2026. Like, I hope you're not thinking that. Like, you should be thinking a little bit longer term than that. We are in 2024 now. And so I hope your application is going to outlive this .NET 8 framework if you're starting from scratch. So if you are, an isolated function is probably the right idea. And then I mentioned the ability to share code with your web apps. So if you have special authentication middleware that you're using to connect to your authentication provider, you want to connect to a specific key store, maybe you want to connect to have everything wrapped to send it to a specific logging provider, don't want to do that configuration over and over again. If you use an isolated function, you've got a middleware that is very similar to how your web apps work. So it's really easy to kind of package up and share that code between your web applications and your function apps, even without using the web application function runtime that I mentioned. You still have access to that same middleware pipeline that your web application is going to run in. You're going to see a program CS file very similar to what gets created for a web app or for a console app. And you can just keep chaining together different dependencies for configuration, for your dependency injection, for anything else that you might need in order to get that application up and running in a consistent manner. So you've got that flexibility now with your isolated functions, being able to put all that together and make sure that it runs in a cohesive manner between your functions and you're not hacking in these different workarounds. Like I mentioned, you can do middleware with an in-process function. It's not the cleanest. You could do dependency injection with an in-process function. We do it every day. But again, it requires additional extension packages that you have to install. Whereas with an isolated function, all of that stuff is kind of built in out of the box and available to you. Got a number of resources here. Take a look at some of these. What's new in .NET 8, C#, .NET Core. If you want to dig into .NET Aspire, it's a great link here. Microsoft's got a ton of documentation together. If you want to migrate your applications from an isolated to an in-process, they also have a guide there. there is also a guide if you want to migrate from Newtonsoft JSON to system text JSON. Now, why would you want to do that? Not everything is supported. I'll tell you that right now. Everything that you're doing in Newtonsoft is not necessarily supported in system text JSON. But why would you want to upgrade? Number one, it's the latest and greatest from Microsoft. They are actively maintaining it. James Newton King, who wrote Newtonsoft JSON, works for Microsoft now. And he's helping develop that system text JSON package that is now built into the framework. So system text JSON gives you a lot of flexibility. I've seen it come a long way, building out more APIs, making more serialization options available. It is going to be much faster, much more lightweight, much less memory intensive. I've seen applications upgrade from Newtonsoft to system text JSON and have very positive results. So definitely consider that, especially if you're starting a brand new project and you're not dependent upon external libraries, which may have different serialization attributes. Because remember, the serialization is different. If you put serialization attributes that belong to the Newtonsoft JSON library on a model and try serializing it with system text JSON, you're not going to be happy with the result. So definitely give that a look, though. Take into consideration what is and isn't available. Any questions? Yeah.
So would you say like the biggest hurdles from .NET 6, .NET 8 and function apps outside of the processing would be the serialization of the JSON, and also the extension packages will change from being a package to being supported natively?
I would say the biggest hurdles that I encountered, it depends on the function app, but specifically durable functions are a huge hurdle. The API model is very different in durable functions. The automatic upgrader does not do a lot of the things that it needs to in order to get things to use the new API, the new structure. One of the things that developers tend to do with functions a lot, that I've been trying to push them away from for a while, is they inject a lot of their parameters, including the logger, into their method parameters versus into a dependency injection on the constructor. And with the isolated runtime, you're going to have to change that. That's going to have to go into the constructor versus your function methods. So that's been a big hurdle that I've seen. There are just a lot of differences, like especially durable functions being replayable, needing to make sure that you're using the correct logger. So using a replayable logger in your orchestrator versus a regular logger, so that you're not duplicating those logs. So yeah, I would say all of that kind of stuff, durable functions has probably been the biggest hurdle, but outside of that, definitely the serialization, that's where it can really get tricky. I did also find some issues when I was applying the configuration providers within the program file. So I found that if you want to read any of the function apps built-in configuration, you need to explicitly register the environment variable configuration provider. Whereas with the isolated or in process, you do not need to do that. So I did find that difference.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
A test only on consumption premium, or did you try it on premium?
I just did it on consumption. Yeah.
That's total.
Right. Yeah, maybe I'll try that. I was using my own subscription where I've got 150 credits, so I've got plenty of wiggle room there. I'm glad you brought up the plans though. So I mentioned all of these tests here were done using Windows plans. I did test it using a Linux plan. Did not put the Linux number up here because I tested the Linux one on a different network, and it was at a different time. And so the numbers were coming out a little bit weird, especially when I ran like the Linux one and I tried to compare it with the .NET 6 that I ran. The numbers just didn't look right. So I didn't feel comfortable putting them up there. However, what I did find is that on average, the Linux plan was about 10% slower. Go Windows. Yeah, Brad.
On this one, on the bottom, you're talking about RAM usage.
Yeah.
Memory usage. You said you saw an increase almost every time. Is that specifically to just functions versus say web apps? We've kind of seen the opposite result with web apps, that anything half about.
Yes, yeah, so this was a specific upgrade from an in-process to an isolated, is where I saw the jump there, not necessarily from a function going from 6 to 8. Any other questions?
The instances did that go out to? Did you pre-scale it? Like, did you run it once, then run it again while it was scaled so you didn't get any scaling activity?
I did not know. No, so I could probably try and pull that up here. Yeah, any other questions while I'm trying to pull that up?
That's a good question. I'm a little confused. I'm a little ignorant on some of these topics, but does that mean like mutual connections, like just like a regular web hook or something, or a web socket or something like that? Or what exactly are you talking about with connections?
That's a great question. I don't think we've ever really gotten a great definition.
Really, your outgoing connections from your function.
Is that it?
That's what you're doing, right? If you're in a consumption premium, you're limited to 600. I think it's still 600. And then what we've experienced is folks would do proper connection sharing. And then as soon as you hit that 600 mark, it will actually stop accepting new connections. Your function have to start throwing 429s to the caller.
Gotcha.
So we see that too. Now that when we have good code, we see that 30, 40, 50 connections. Doesn't matter. 7 million, executions a day, and it'll only be, 50 connections that are active.
Yeah, so Microsoft has a lot of documentation regarding like connection management, performance management within their functions. So best practices use the HTTP client factory in order to create a new HTTP client instead of just newing it up. And then also whenever you're connecting to Cosmos, using a singleton. And so I used a singleton here, and you can see the connections like, it didn't skyrocket or anything like that. So it remained pretty stable even throughout 7,000 connections.
So this is kind of like the as a service that we're just not going to worry about that until we start to see some issues. Right, basically.
Yep. Yeah. So I'm definitely not worried about the 19 I see here, but moving to an isolated function, and I see that go up in the 50s. Given the issues that we've had in the past, that is a little bit concerning to me because we're moving all of our functions to isolated, or at least most of them.
Yeah. See, I'm a little confused because I would think that more connection would be better given the same resource, but I'm not thinking about it.
More is not better here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Until there's not enough in the pool, then more is better.
Yes. Run out. Yeah, didn't run out, had plenty of resources available here, so not too concerned about that. But just something that we'll be keeping an eye on. I did run some load testing after this was deployed into our lower environments, and everything seemed fine. But it will be something because we have had issues in a production environment where they do not happen in the lower environment. So it's just one of those things. We've not been able to nail down exactly what caused it. Yeah, Ken.
I know this is not the best case scenario, but I'm just wondering what a test would look like in a .NET 8 in process. I know it's not recommended but if you're talking about a critical performance scenario, just curious how the .NET 6 in process versus .NET 8 in process would look on a test like that.
So I would be curious as well. .NET 8 in process is not currently available.
Oh, you said it's not available.
It is not available yet. So yeah, Microsoft only pushed out the .NET 8 isolated at this time, and that's been out in GA since .NET 8 went out. They have not yet set a timeline, at least not that I've been able to find, on when in process will be available. I did look today, and it still is not available.
Okay.
It may be this earlier this year, but then from a timeline perspective, that's all they said.
Right, yeah. Yeah, the roadmap is very vague. So I've got that function app pulled up here. I'll switch screens in just a second. Let me grab where I was doing that test. All right. All right. So Russ, I pulled up here, the chart from yesterday when I was doing the testing here. So you can see for the most part, it stayed on one instance. That's in the .NET 8 isolated one. So it did spin up and it looks like 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 total. But the latter half had 0.
As long as you had them out there when your test was running and weren't like, oh, I'm busy, let's add another node.
Right,
So
yeah.
you can get that stuttering in your test.
Right. Well, this was all just the consumption plan, not even the premium consumption. And so I just let Azure handle all the scaling. And it looks like it did a decent job. It handled most of the requests there. Maybe if I threw more load at it, had additional people hitting it at the same time. But from what I've seen, like this kind of load over a 3-minute time period is not something that we typically see in production.
If you started and you had one instance and in your 3 minutes and at the end you ended with 10, that could impact your results versus starting if you already had 10 and running your test. It doesn't have to scale.
Right. So it looks like it only created those other instances on the 3rd iteration. So these 3 humps here. So I ran that test 3 times. And in each of those, the first 2, it looks like it handled everything with the single instance. That 3rd iteration, it probably said, oh, wait a minute, we should probably spin up a few more.
You're playing with the Amperix one and the consumption, you could breathe on them and get them to scale. It was pretty easy. Until it hit the max.
Right. Now let's see if there's a noticeable difference with the .NET 6 in-process app. So I did run these all on separate function apps, separate plans, just so that I could potentially rerun anything that I need to or see these metrics. Let's look into the in-process app. Back over the last 48 hours. Split it. Well, that's interesting. So here it started scaling out the instances right away during the first test. And it kept those going for all 3. It's interesting the way that it handles that scaling and the splitting a little bit differently.
Premium and just pin it to 5 nodes, whatever.
Right, yeah. Yep, yeah, maybe I'll do that. All right, cool, good info. Any other questions? Yeah, this is it.
Thanks, man.
Thank you.
The full session I think that we made. Try. Maybe a few seconds. Probably
Don't seal now because it doesn't work. I don't know. I haven't changed it. 21 days. It gets down to where I do the task went off on one of them. It just exits.
I just stored your script to be exact.
Oh.